There we go. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to our Garden Guru program. This is a joint project, as Bethany said, between the Wood County Master Gardener Volunteers and the Marshfield Library. And so I wish to welcome you. If you're joining us from out of state, as Bethany said, we are doing Zone 4 gardening. So if you're not in Zone 4, you might have to adjust this a little bit. A couple of things before we get started, some general things. Plants usually stop growing at around 50 degrees. So if you have garden plants that are still out there growing and not froze yet, they will continue to grow as long as the temperature is above 50 degrees. Another thing that comes into play in the fall is frost. And just a little note about how to predict frost. The Weather Service is really good about predicting frost and freeze the first time it happens. And then after that, they consider it to have happened, and therefore they don't issue any advisories anymore. So if you're lucky enough to have protected your plants or just not having had your plants freeze yet, a little bit on how to predict frost. On a clear, windless night, the dew point temperature is a rough prediction of the lowest temperature that will be reached that night. The temperature rarely falls below the dew point, and you can look this up on any number of online weather websites. If you have a cloudy or windy night, it's a little bit harder to predict exactly how cold it will get. And also, if you live in a low area compared to the surrounding terrain, you will probably get a few degrees colder because cold tends to travel downhill and settle in the low areas. So those are just some tips that if you still have plants growing, it might give you an idea of how cold it might get, even though the weatherman isn't going to tell you anymore whether it's going to freeze or not. And with that, we'll start our presentation. I'm going to stop my video here. Okay, we are talking about winterizing your yard and garden, and the topics that will be covered. I can get my screen to, there we go. We're going to be talking, whoops, got to go back one. We missed one. Missed a couple here. Okay. Topics covered. We're going to be talking about lawns, annuals, which are plants that grow for one season, and at the end of the season, they die. Perennials are plants that come back year after year. Your vegetable gardens, planting bulbs, taking care of the summer ones and the ones for next year. Trees and shrubs, and then general maintenance tasks that have to do with gardening. The first topic is lawns. Grass will continue to grow until about 34 degrees, and the roots will continue to grow until the ground freezes. That's why fertilizing in the late fall is a good time, because the roots are still growing and they'll take up that fertilizer and be ready to really start off good in the spring. Continue to mow high until the last mowing in the fall. Lawns should be mowed at about 3 to 3.5 inch height all summer. The last mowing should be about 2 to 2.5 inches, and this is to prevent a lot of excess leaves on top of the ground, and that will prevent snow mold. Fall is a good time for aerating with a core aerator if you have a compacted soil in your lawn. You would want to core aerate and then add possibly compost. The lawn will recover better now than if you do it in the spring because of the cooler temperatures and there's less pressure from weeds. Aerating improves water and nutrient movement in clay or compacted soils. And aerating, when you do it, you should have 20 to 40 holes per square foot. Leave the plugs on the lawn. If it rains and whatever, eventually they will break down. After a couple of mowings or a couple of rains, you might be able to rake, and then that kind of breaks them up and lets them lay on the lawn. Dethatching can also be done in the fall if you have more than 1 inch of thatch. Mulching mowers do not increase thatch. Thatch generally comes from overwatering or over fertilizing, or the soil is very compacted. Again, it's better done in the fall probably than the spring because your plants have more time to recover before it would get hot and dry in the summer. Fertilizing. If you only fertilize once a year, you would want to do that in mid to late October. We have what we call a holiday schedule in fertilizing lawns, depending on how many times you want to fertilize. If you were to do it 2 times in a year, the next one that you would add would be late May or early June or around Memorial Day. If 3 applications, you would add early September, which would be Labor Day. And then 4th one would be late June or early July, which is 4th of July. Do not fertilize in July though, if the weather is going to be hot and dry, unless the lawn will be watered all summer. So the holiday schedule is Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day, and Halloween, with the Halloween schedule mid to late October being probably the most important one. In the fall, you should add 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer per 100 square feet, if that is the only application you're making for the whole year. You can determine the amount of nitrogen that's in fertilizer is by taking the number that you see on the bottom of the screen here. This first number is nitrogen. The second number should be 0 for lawn fertilizers in Wisconsin. That's phosphorus, and we all know what extra phosphorus does to our waterways and water systems. The third number is potassium, and most soils in Wisconsin have enough potassium, so that number can be quite low. But in order to find out how much nitrogen is actually in this bag of fertilizer, you would multiply the pounds that are in the bag. In this case, this is 15.52 pounds times 0.29, and that will give you the amount of nitrogen that's in that bag. And so you would want to apply, meet that out over your lawn so that there's about 1 to 1.5 pounds per square foot. You can leave the clippings on the lawn all year, and that's worth 1 fertilizing if you use a mulching mower and leave the clippings on the lawn. Another thing when you're talking about lawns is leaves. If you have a lot of leaves falling on your lawn, they need to be raked regularly, or they can be mulched with a mower. As long as you can see the grass blades, it's okay to leave the mowing leaves on the lawn because it adds nutrients to the lawn. If there's an enormous amount of leaves, you might want to place them on your driveway and run over them with your mower several times. You can then use the chopped leaves for mulch or to till into the vegetable garden to decompose over the winter, or you could put it in the compost pile, mixing it with green plant matter. A thick layer of leaves will kill or stunt the grass. So you don't want to let the leaves pile up on the lawn. Also, fall is a good time for weed control in lawns. Weed control is best in the fall after the first frost. This time is more effective because the plant is pulling nutrients from the leaves down into the crown and roots for winter storage, and it is more likely to take the herbicide along with it and kill the roots as well as the foliage. You can think of this situation as a 2-lane highway with the nutrients going up to the leaves and down to the roots during the growing season. In the fall, both lanes are traveling down to the roots. If you're going to put on granular fertilizer, you would apply it to the moist foliage early in the morning. And if you want to stick to hard to kill weeds, add a little dish detergent to the weed killers to help it stick to things like violets. If you're looking for herbicides, a mix that contains 2 to 3 chemicals will cover most weeds. And if you've done some sowing of new lawn or that sort of thing, you need to wait for 2 to 3 mowings before you apply an herbicide. This is a chart that indicates which of the common herbicide ingredients are most effective for different weeds that are commonly found in our lawns here. So you can take a look. There's 2,4-D, mecoprop, dicamba, and triclopyr. You notice that wood violets should be treated in the fall, once in mid-September and then once again in late October. And they are still kind of resistant to any kind of herbicides. You might end up having to hand dig them out of your lawn. So that's one that is not easily killed by any type of herbicide. Crabgrass in your lawn, too late for that right now. You need to add a pre-emergent herbicide in the spring. If you find it in your lawn now, you can hand pull it and get rid of it that way. But at this time of the year, because it's a grass, an herbicide is not going to kill it. So you need to do some hand work, hand pulling, or back here, or wait till next spring to do that weed control. Creeping Charlie, if you have that in your lawn, is best controlled after a killing frost. It might sprout again in the spring, but will usually die. It may come back from seed, or if you haven't hit all of the leaves on a patch of it. Follow the directions exactly when you use any herbicide. The directions on the label are a law, and you are disobeying the law if you misuse the herbicide. Besides, it is kind of dangerous to misuse an herbicide. They're strong chemicals, and you want to use them correctly, not more, not less than what you need. Be sure to wear protective clothing, as it's suggested on the label. Lawns can be seeded until about September 20th, so we're kind of reaching the end of the point at which you could seed a lawn. Although with the warm weather predicted for the next week, it might work pretty good yet. Fall is a good time for reseeding lawns because the soil is still relatively warm and there's enough time for roots to develop before the frost. Sodding can also be done for maybe another week or 2 or 3 yet. If you're reseeding a lawn or seeding a new lawn, apply half the seed in a horizontal direction and half in a vertical direction with a drop seeder. There's more information on taking care of lawns, reseeding lawns, starting lawns, all of that sort of thing at the Learning Store, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to check here. Do we have any questions? No questions yet on lawns. So we're going to go on to the next part of the program. We're going to be talking about annual plants, and these are the ones that when they freeze in the fall or when the fall comes around, they're pretty much done for the year. When there's light frost, you can protect them from frost if you want to keep them around for a little while longer. Oftentimes when we have our first frost, after that we have another week or 2 or sometimes more where we're frost free so that you could enjoy those plants for a little bit longer. If you're using frost protection, cloth, pails, boxes, anything that can be put over the plants will work. Non-plastic tarps are better, or non-plastic materials. Plastic tends to transmit the cold quite quickly to the plants. You can also get specially designed row covers or frost blankets. Row covers work well because they can be left on for a few days. So if you're going to have a couple of nights where there's a possibility of frost, you can leave them on because water and light will penetrate the fabric. Cover the plants in the late afternoon and then remove in the next morning when it warms up. Plants that are in planters can be moved in a garage or into the house or underneath a porch sometimes. Even trees provide some frost protection as opposed to an area that is not under a tree. Once it freezes for good, you need to pull the annual plants, and you can compost those in a home compost pile unless they're diseased. Break anything you put into the compost pile into small pieces for faster composting. Diseased plants should be burned, buried, or disposed of in the trash according to your local ordinances. If you want to save some things for next year, one way, or actually there's two ways you can do it. You can either take slips or cuttings from the plants you have, or you can collect seeds for next year. The only seeds that you should not collect are those from hybrid plants. And usually it'll say that in the description of the plant. Those seeds will not come true to form the following year because the plant is a hybrid. Some annuals will reseed by themselves. If you have plants where there are seeds on the plants, when you pull them, you can sprinkle those seeds around the ground where the plants are growing. And then don't till these areas in the fall or the spring, and mark it so that they're not disturbed again in the spring. These plants may get a little slower start than starting seeds indoors, but they will soon catch up. Winter sowing is another possibility. We'll talk more about that later. Seeds are planted in potting mix in containers such as milk jugs or soda bottles and left outside during the winter. For more information on this, search winter sowing method extension. And the advantage is that you don't have to have indoor space and lights to start plants. If you want to bring plants indoors to save them at the end of the growing season, you want to gradually move them from the bright light outside to lower light situations like under trees, or on a porch or a shady area during the day. You need to check for insects regularly because it's very easy to bring insects in from the outside on these plants. Hand pick the large ones or use insecticidal soap, or take the plants into your bathtub and give them a shower. All of these will help remove some of the insects. You may need to do several treatments before all the eggs have hatched and the adults have been eliminated. In the meantime, keep these plants separate from your other indoor plants until you are sure they are pest-free. If you bring a plant inside, you will need to expect that the leaves will probably turn yellow and drop on many plants due to the decrease in light. The plant will grow new, more shade-adjusted leaves once it's in the house. Some people cut the plant back when bringing it indoors and others leave it as is. I would probably recommend that you only cut it back to the point where it's a manageable size to bring inside. Most plants that you grow outside will probably need some supplemental lighting if they're inside. Otherwise, they're going to get tall and gangly. It's called legginess. Little fertilizer should be used on the plants in the winter because they are just biding their time until spring if they're outdoor plants. In late winter, and if the plant has regrown leaves, well, a light fertilizer can be used. Be careful not to overwater. Water only when the top inch or more of the soil is dry. Overwatering can cause fungus gnats and root rot inside. If you're bringing in tropical plants that are used to having high humidity and that sort of thing, regular misting or placing the plant on a pan of gravel and water can increase the humidity in the immediate area of the plant. You'll probably know that it's not getting enough moisture if the tips of the leaves turn brown. Spider mites are an insect that may show up later when the air gets dry, and this might be several weeks after you bring the plant inside. Look for light webbing between the leaves of the plants. White flies can also show up later, and they can be trapped on yellow cardboard or paper printed with tanglefoot, which is a sticky material that when they land on it, they're stuck. Fungus gnats can be discouraged by keeping the top of the soil dry or by covering it with a little sand or gravel. If you're bringing in geraniums, there's a couple of ways to do this. You can leave it in the pot, stop watering, and store the plant in complete darkness, like in a basement or something. Or you can dig up the plant, hang it upside down, and store it that way, or Store it in a paper bag in a cool basement. You probably need to spritz it with water occasionally to keep them dormant but alive until early spring when they can be replanted in pots. At that point, cut off any stems that are not green inside or look shriveled or brown. Another method of keeping plants over winter is to take cuttings of the tender ends of the stems or branches. Place them in water until roots grow, or treat them with a rooting hormone and plant in potting mix. Treat as you would overwintering plants mentioned above. Check the extension for information on a specific method to use for a specific plant. Some work well in the rooting in water routine, and some of them would rot if you leave it in water, so they should be planted directly into a potting mix. You might have to put those cuttings planted in the potting mix inside a plastic bag loosely so that the moisture stays kind of high around the plant so it doesn't dry out until it grows sufficient roots. And also note your success or failure for next year. When you take those plants out, it's a good idea to sometimes take pictures before it freezes, or else just make a few notes that this worked really well here and that didn't work there at all. I should try something different next year, so that when you start looking at plants in the winter or next spring, you have some thing to go by to improve your garden for the next year. Questions before we move on? I see none. Okay, we're going to go on then to talk about, okay, we did that one already. Perennials. Trim and destroy any diseased parts of the plants when you're cleaning up your perennial bed. Do not prune perennials after August 1st, and that's really past for now, but something to remember next year. If you prune after August 1st, the new growth, whenever you prune, the plant will start to put out new growth below where you pruned. And if you do that too late in the season, that new growth is not hardened off or hardy before before it freezes, and so it's likely that that new growth will freeze and not survive the winter. Let's see. Cutting or not to cut. This is a question that people ask often, and it's kind of up to you. If you do not cut back perennials, except for the diseased parts of the plant, many of them provide winter interest when the frost and the snow is in your yard and there's little else to look at. And many of them also provide food for wildlife. The birds and other critters use those seed pods and that sort of thing for food. Leaving perennials is also important for many native bee species and other beneficial insects. They use the stems and the litter around the plants as sheltered overwintering spots. Of course, if insects have been a pest and a problem for you, then remove the foliage. If you decide not to cut it back, you're going to probably experience some reseeding in the spring. And that's good if you want to increase the number of plants you have. It's not so good if you don't want to have to remove all those extra plants in the spring. If you leave the leaves, the foliage on the plant, the litter protects the crown of the plant, and there's less mulch that will be needed to keep that crown healthy. Mulch also limits some of the reseeding. If you're worried about reseeding, if you've mulched your flower bed, it's harder for those little seeds to get a start if there's mulch there. Somebody raised a hand here. Is that a question? I don't see here right now. Ask a question if you have a question. I can't see on my screen when you raise your hand where you are or who you are. Dividing and replanting. Early fall is a good time to divide some perennials. I would do it pretty soon now, not wait too long, because it allows the roots to establish yet without a lot of heat and pressure from insects and that sort of thing. Spring blooming plants like irises, peonies, and lilies can be divided in the fall. If you divide peonies, note that they might not bloom the year after dividing. Plants like hostas, daylilies, and grasses can be divided now or in the spring. One thing to look at to determine whether a plant needs to be divided or not is look to see, does the center seem to be dying out? So there's hardly anything growing in the center. It looks like kind of a ring with the active growing material around the outside. Or if the plant splays open in the middle, and this is often happens with sedums, that means that the plant needs to be divided. Or maybe it has diminished blooming. It's just not as hardy as it was before and doesn't seem to bloom as well. Okay, now if you cut the perennials in the fall, don't apply mulch until after Thanksgiving or when the ground has frozen. Mulch can be things like straw, shredded leaves, Christmas tree branches, compost. Don't use unshredded leaves. The whole leaves pack down too tightly. Roses should be watered well all fall. Clean up all of the leaves. That's to keep disease from staying with the plant. If it's a grafted rose, you need to protect the graft by mounding soil over the crown late in the fall, or mulch it really well and then cover with rose cones. You would want to do the pruning of roses in the spring. Another way that roses can be overwintered is to dig a trench and carefully lay the plant down in the trench and then cover with soil and mulch. If you have a shrub rose, you don't really have to worry too much about anything, maybe just a little cleanup around the plant. Winter sowing, we talked about that a little bit earlier. It is planting the seeds of perennials in milk jugs or like 2-liter pop bottles. What you do is to slice the milk jug or the pop bottle almost all the way through horizontally, about 3 or 4 inches from the bottom. Punch several holes in the bottom and add 2 to 4 inches of potting soil. Scatter the seeds, water it down, and then tape that cut closed and remove the cover. Then you place this outside somewhere, not right under the eaves of your house, somewhere out in your yard, and you leave it there until spring. You don't do anything else with it. Many perennial seeds need what's called cold treatment in order for the seed to actually sprout. The thawing and the freezing all winter helps to soften the seed coat so that it can actually sprout in the spring. This works especially well for native plants. Of course, if your perennials are in containers, you'll need to move them to an unheated garage or to bury the entire container in the garden. Container plants get colder than ground plants because they're above the ground level, and they may not survive if left above ground or outside in cold temperatures without some kind of insulation. So let's check here. Do we have any questions? I don't see any questions. Check the chat here. Let's see. Problems with hydrangea freezing over winter. You might have to kind of, you can provide some kind of windbreak, might be a possibility. If this plant is like on the north or west side of a house or kind of out in the open, that might be still be too extreme even if the plant is wrapped. Would be my suggestion. If anyone else has anything else that they would maybe suggest. Okay, let's go on to talking about bulbs then. Oh, wait a minute. Nope, vegetable gardens first. Sorry about that. When you're doing, when vegetable gardens are done for the season, you need to remove all vegetation and either compost anything that's not diseased or destroy it according to your local ordinances, whether you can burn, bury, or you have to put it out in the trash. Especially remove all weeds. A lot of people think, oh, okay, the weeds died, it's the end of the season, it's not, I'm not gonna do that anymore. I'll just wait for next year. Not a good idea. There's an old saying that says 1 year's seeding makes for 7 years weeding. And there are some weeds that the seeds will survive for a lot longer than 7 years. So do remove all of the weeds from your garden and also from around your garden too, because over the winter, those weed seeds will probably blow in on the wind. Do not compost any weeds that have gone to seed. Most home compost piles do not get hot enough to destroy the weed seeds. So all you're doing is putting them in your compost pile and then putting them back on your garden with the finished compost for them to grow again. If you're harvesting vegetables that you're going to be storing for the winter, most of those need to be cured. And what you do is to place them in a warm, dry area for 2 to 3 weeks. And then you would store them in a cool basement area. And again, for specific vegetables, Extension has many publications on how and where to store specific vegetables. So you could look up also at the Learning Store. You want to protect the garden soil from erosion. You can cover it with shredded leaves or compost or other mulch, or you can use cover crops. Cover crops can be planted over the summer and fall whenever you take out any plants that are done producing. Things like oats, annual fescues, annual rye, buckwheat, and soybeans will keep growing until it's about 40 degrees. Then you till them under in spring for what's called green manure. So it's kind of like fertilizer, but it's a lot cheaper. Cover crops protect the soil from erosion and build up soil nutrients. They also break the disease cycle by adding an additional crop year to rotation. We always say that when you're planting vegetables, you should rotate your crops, just like farmers rotate their crops. And plants from the same family should not be planted in the same space, if you can help it, for 4 years. And so by putting in this cover crop, it's like adding another year into the rotation cycle because you've had another crop growing in there for that, that short period of time. Onions and radish seeds can be planted just before the ground freezes up for early growth in spring. You might want to try that. I haven't tried that yet, but this is what I found in some of the materials I was using to prepare this presentation. I'm not sure if it works for zone 4, but we could give it a try and see. They're relatively inexpensive. Garlic is the other thing that you would want to plant in fall. It should be planted in October, probably not quite yet now, because you want there to be root growth, but no top growth coming out of the ground. Be sure to mark where you plant the garlic so that when you till the garden next spring or plant it in the spring, you don't plant over the garlic. Again, with this garden, you need to note where each vegetable grew so that if you didn't have a planting plan in the spring, you'll want to do that now so that next year when you plant, you don't plant the same plant in the same place. Different plant families should not be grown in the same place year after year, or even for as many as 3 or 4 years if you have the garden space to move them around. And some of the plant families, for example, are tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. That's the nightshade family. And we have the cabbage family, like cabbages, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. Legumes would be peas, beans, and that sort of thing. And then the mustard family, which is things like radishes and turnips and rutabaga, kohlrabi, those kind of things, kale. And then another common vegetable family is alliums, which is onions and garlic. Also take note on which varieties grew well and which didn't. Some years you have a particular variety of a tomato that worked really well. And so you'd want to remember which one that was so that you can get it again the following year. You might also want to note any unusual weather conditions that you had that year and what plants particularly became diseased or did not produce well, so that when you're looking for varieties next year, you can look, for example, for disease-resistant plants next year. Let's see, questions and answers. Do you get the, no, you wouldn't really want the garlic cloves to start rooting indoors. Just put them out. You break the clove of the head of garlic into the individual cloves when you plant them. You don't peel them. You leave the peeling on of the individual cloves. And then you plant them with the pointed end up and probably about 2 to 3 inches deep would be the correct depth to plant them. And then they probably should be mulched too. If you have some straw you can put over it, some leaves, something like that. Does that answer the question? Okay, moving on to bulbs. Spring blooming bulbs should be planted in October. Same reason as garlic. You want the roots to start growing, but you don't want the bulb to start coming up out of the ground. And so people are there, if you're planting things like daffodils and tulips and things like that, you would want to wait until October. And then be sure to mark where they are so that when you're putting in plants in the spring, or if you may be tilling something or whatever, that you don't dig them up again. One of the things that you have often have problems with is things like squirrels and gophers and that sort of thing, digging up the bulbs after you plant them. One thing that you can do is to create a box of chicken wire, a box shape with a bottom and sides, and then turn that over and place it over the bulbs in the hole, and then put your soil on top. The plant will grow through the wire box, and the squirrels and stuff will not be able to dig down and get it. So that's one thing that you can do. Another is you can get repellents that you can put on the bulbs that will kind of discourage animals from digging them up and chewing on them. You can also put a screen over the top of the ground rather than the box in the ground, and hope that your squirrels won't dig around it. After the ground freezes, you would want to mulch those bulbs to prevent premature sprouting when we get those warm spells in the late winter, but it's not really time for the bulbs to come out of the ground yet. Tender bulbs are the ones that have been blooming now in the summer, and those, if you leave them in the ground, will be killed by frost. And so after the frost kills the top, then you would want to carefully dig those tender bulbs and cure those by letting them dry in a cool, dry area for a few days. Gently brush off the soil. Don't scrub them because that will break the surface of the bulb and they'll be more likely to spoil. Store them in dry peat moss, sawdust, or perlite in a cool area. Usually 40 to 45 degrees or so is good for most bulbs, some a little warmer. Check every month over the winter for rot, mold, or spoilage and remove those bulbs to keep the other bulbs from also becoming rotten. If they appear shriveled or light in weight, they can be misted lightly. Gladiola bulbs can be stored in mesh bags. They don't have to be put in the peat moss. Let's see. Another idea might be to plant cold hardy pansies in the bulb area now for fall color, and also to cover next spring's withering bulb foliage. Now is a good time, and it has to be done quite soon if you want to plant bulbs in pots for forcing in the winter, because they have to have a cooling period before they'll come up. So if you want to enjoy those really early, late winter blooms of things like narcissus and that sort of thing, now would be the time to plant those bulbs. Let's see. Trees and shrubs. Trees can be transplanted up to 6 weeks before the ground freezes. All trees should be kept well watered until the ground freezes and mulched with 3 to 5 inches of cover over the root zone, especially of those new trees that you're planting, but don't let the mulch touch the bark. You want to keep a space in between to prevent the bark from rotting. If you're planting trees in the fall, they probably should be loosely staked. You don't want them staked real tight, but there should be some slack in that staking rope or wire. Young trees, it's a good idea to wrap them to prevent sun scald. That happens when the south or the southwest side of the bark gets sun in the wintertime, and the bark surface heats up really fast. And then when it goes into the shade or the sun sets, then it freezes, and that will cause the bark to split. Another thing you can do is to paint the bark with 1 part latex paint mixed with 4 parts of water, and you want to use a light colored paint like a white when you do that. Other winter protection for the critters, you could use hardware cloth. It's a metal mesh, and you want to use a fairly small opening. Bury that on maybe 2 to 3 inches into the ground around the trunk, and that will keep things like mice, moles, and voles, and the critters that live under the snow from eating the bark of the tree. Cut the grass very short around the trunk before it freezes. And then another thing you can do is to, once it snows, pack snow around the trunk really, really firmly. And you can even add a little bit of water to make it icy, so that when that critter comes, digging through the snow and it hits that ice, it'll kind of be discouraged from going any further. Rabbits, you have to think about where the snow line might be in the wintertime, because rabbits feed above the snow line. So you're going to have to cage it, cage a plant to prevent the rabbits from browsing on it. Same thing for deer, either fencing, caging, or some kind of repellent that will have to be probably applied several times over the course of the winter. Continue to water evergreens also until the ground freezes. And this is a really important one, because they transpire all winter and they will get winter burn if not well watered. The sun causes the leaves to transpire, but they cannot replace the lost moisture because the ground is frozen. In addition to keeping them well watered, if you have ones that usually suffer winter burn, provide some wind protection, either with a snow fence or wrap the trees in burlap. Trees and shrubs with weak trunks like junipers and those tall ones should be wrapped or tied about 2/3 of the way up the tree to keep heavy snow and ice from bending and breaking the trunk and branches. In case we do get ice in the wintertime, do not go out there and try and knock the ice off the trees and shrubs. Let it melt by itself. You usually cause more damage to the tree by trying to get it off the tree than if you just leave it there. Trees produce a lot of leaves. If you have trees in your yard, you can bag dry leaves and store them against a foundation for mulching perennials next spring. You can add it, mixing it with greens to your compost pile next summer if you save them. They also provide insulation on the foundation, or like we talked about earlier, you can run over them with the mower and use the shredded leaves for mulching perennials or covering bare soil. Do not use whole leaves in any of those situations because they pack down and suffocate the crown of the plant. I'm going to again check here if we have any questions. And any chat. All right. Whoops. Back up here. The last thing we're going to talk about is some other maintenance tasks. If you have used containers for planting during the spring and summer, you want to empty those containers, and you can put the potting soil in your flower beds or your garden or your compost pile and wash them out. If there was any diseased plants in it, you can soak the containers in a 10% bleach solution for 30 minutes and then rinse well to prevent the disease from spreading. You want to be sure to take in especially clay and concrete containers because the thawing and freezing in the wintertime will crack them. And it's a good idea to take in all of the containers too. Your garden tools should be cleaned well. Can remove any rust with steel wool or sanding paper. Repair, sharpen, lightly coat them with oil with a rag. And then they'll be all ready for you to go for next spring and not be rusting away during the winter. Things like tillers and lawnmowers and that sort of thing. It's a good thing to empty them of gas in the fall. Clean them, replace the filters, and again, sharpen the blade. It's probably much easier to get it sharpened this time of the year than it is when you try and do it next May. If you have a garden hose, be sure to drain that before you store it and store it inside. Seed storage. If you have seeds left over from this year's growing season, they can be stored in a tightly closed container with a desiccant to keep them dry. An easy one, if you don't want to go out and buy them, is to wrap a couple of tablespoons of dry powdered milk in a paper towel and tie the ends together with a rubber band and store that with your seeds, or place them in a tightly closed container in your refrigerator over the winter. The refrigeration is not necessary if you have another cool place in your house where you can store them, like a basement. The conditions you want for seed storage is dry and cool. Seeds will store anywhere from 1 to 5 years depending on the type of seed. So if you want to do a seed test before you start planting them next year, the thing is to plant 10 seeds. Just put them on a wet paper towel inside a plastic bag and put them in a nice warm place. And then if 8 of them sprout, you know that you have 80% germination next year, and you might want to just plant them a little bit thicker. If you only have 2 or 3 germinate, that might not be seeds to keep to plant for your garden. You might want to toss them next year. Planting the garden for next year, again, make notes of walk around your yard and just take a garden walk and look what worked well this year, what didn't. Use your phone or a camera to take pictures of your garden. So it's easier to remember when those tempting garden catalogs come in January or the garden stores open up in April and you go and you see this plant that you look like you just have to have. Okay, where am I going to put it when I get it? Do you have any plants that this year did not do well where they were? You might want to check if the growing conditions there are not good. For example, is it too dry? Is there too much shade? Is there too much sun? And maybe those plants should be moved next year. Are there dead spots where more plants are needed? Are there weeks where nothing was blooming? Are the plants too big for their space? Do you need more variety and color and texture? So those are some of the things to think of and make note of this fall so that next year when you're looking for plants or starting the gardening season again, you have all these things already there for you to remember. If there's an area of your yard where you're having a hard time getting anything to grow, it might be the soil. And the fall is a good time to take a soil test. The labs are a lot less busy in the fall, and you can plan what you need to do for amending the soil for next year. Soil should be tested every 3 to 5 years, or if plant problems start developing. And that soil lab, for those of you who are near here listening to this program, is right here in Marshfield on Yellowstone Drive. Last thing, this winter, when you're using all those de-icing compounds, some of them are easier on your yard and plants than others. Calcium, magnesium, and calcium chloride are easier on plants than the sodium chloride that's common salt. Another tip is do a lot of shoveling before you de-ice, because that way you can reduce the amount of de-icer that you need, and when you're shoveling, try to keep that salty snow from being shoveled onto lawns and gardens if you can. Other alternatives are to use things like kitty litter or sand for traction too, instead of salting. So that would be more environmentally probably for your plants anyway, to use one of those other de-icing, not de-icing, but at least de-slippering your sidewalks and things. So any other questions? I'll check the question box again. Let's see. I'm going to stop my screen sharing and turn on my video, see if there's anything else. Anybody out there? Where do we have people from tonight? I see Toronto, Canada. Anybody else want to put in the chat there where you're listening from tonight?
You do have a couple of questions in the Q&A now. Okay,
I'll bring these up again. Oh, extension website. Yes. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. I forgot to tell you that part. Let me see. I want to share my screen. Where are we here? Share. Okay. Extension questions. If you have a question or a topic that you want to research, you would put that in your search line in your search engine and add the word extension. So if you want to say storing winter bulbs extension, and then that will bring up in your search engine, from your search engine, it brings to the top of the list things from university extension publications from all over the United States. The reason you want these rather than a lot of the blogs and things that you can find on the website, on different websites, is that the university information has been tested and proven. And it's not some person who decides they're going to do a gardening blog and give you some tips that they think might work because they worked once for them, that sort of thing. So, and then you'll get them from extensions all over the United States probably. So you want to choose a state that's near your state or one that has a similar zone and climate to your area. So if you're in the upper Midwest, you would do things like Penn State, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, at least Northern Illinois. So you would look for articles from those state extension offices. And so for here, you wouldn't want to choose something like from Arizona because that has a whole different climate and everything than we do right here. So that's one of the things that you can do to search for information. And the other thing is your local extension office usually has some kind of ag or horticultural agent. If you've run out of options searching on by yourself or you still have questions, call your local county extension office and they will often be able to help you. If not immediately, they'll do some researching too. So those are some things that you can do to find information. One other thing I was going to do on the end of here, I usually have an invasive species to be looking out for. And it's something that's usually growing at the time or blooming, so it's very noticeable. Tonight I have Japanese knotweed. And you can see this man here trying to make his way into this thicket of Japanese knotweed. It's quite striking. It looks very tropical. It looks like kind of, it has big leaves. Some of them are 8 to 9 inches long, kind of heart-shaped. And the stems look like, if you see in the picture on the bottom, the stems look like bamboo and they're hollow. It can grow up to 10 to 12 feet high. It prefers more moist areas, but you'll find it on roadsides and in waste areas. And this plant is really a bugger. It can send out roots up to 60 feet away from the closest stem. And as you can see in the picture down here, it comes up through concrete foundations and roadways. So it's a very nasty weed. When it's on stream edges and river edges, it does not hold the soil like regular native plants do. And so there's a lot of erosion going on there. In Marshfield here, there are 2 very noticeable patches. One is on the Wildwood Station Trail just north of Adler Avenue and where it crosses Adams Street. And the other one is on the Veterans Parkway behind the 501 bar. And if you drive by there, you'll see this. It's very impressive looking plant, but very highly invasive and very, very difficult to control because it has an extensive root system. So that I forgot to show that slide also. What do you suggest if you have bulbs, but you aren't sure what they are? Boy, sometimes if you look at catalogs and things like that, bulb catalogs, if you have any neighbors that have bulbs or are gardeners, they might have some clues. The other thing I would say is plant it and see what happens next year. Generally, bulbs are planted is it 2 to 3 times the height of the bulb? So like daffodils are planted usually about 7, 8 inches deep. Tulips about that also. Smaller bulbs are not planted as deep. Yeah, I don't know. The next question, raspberry bushes. It depends what kind of raspberries you have. If you have fall blooming the fall raspberries or the summer raspberries, because they're treated in different ways. I would refer you to, again, that extension address. They have a publication on growing raspberries. And I think when you do cut them down, you can cut them down quite far, but you need to know whether you're cutting down the primocanes or not, because if you cut the wrong canes, you won't have raspberries next year. But if you're cutting them down, you can cut them down fairly close to the ground if they're the spent canes. Does that answer the question?
While we're waiting for any other possible questions, we have Jeanette from New Jersey, Vicky from Wausau, Mariola from Fair Lawn, New Jersey, Lynn from Ripon. I don't think I'm seeing anybody else, but we did have Allie had mentioned being from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And now there is another question for you now that we got through all of that.
Willow shrub. I'm not real familiar with that one. As a general rule, I would say I don't know if I would want to trim it. Again, if you know where you got it from, if it was from a nursery, you can maybe check with them too as to what how you should care for it. Again, maybe look it up on the internet again, see if you can find something about that particular plant. I don't know if, like I say, I'm not sure on that one. That's something I'm not familiar with. Bought it locally in Wisconsin at a nursery or like a Shopko or Lowe's or a nursery would be able to probably tell you how to take care of it. When adding compost to soil, does it need to be worked into the soil? Either way, it can be just placed on top and it will gradually over the winter, and then you might want to till it in next spring. Or you can just leave it on top. Some people also mulch gardens with compost in the summertime too, instead of using things like straw or whatever. So it can be either way if you want to work it in or if you want to leave it on top.
While we give it a moment in case anybody else has any further questions, I am going to be posting right in the chat the link to the live stream version of this video. I've seen a couple of people that have just joined us, and I think they were in a different time zone and thought that we started at 7 p.m. Central Time or something along those lines. However, it's slightly different for you. I have a feeling it got mixed up for a few people, so I wanted to make sure that that link has been posted so you can go back and watch it back if you would like to. Additionally, I am going to be sending out an email Wednesday, if at the very latest on Friday, with the link to the final video once it has been fully processed by YouTube as well. And I haven't seen any other questions pop up while I was rambling.
Just blows my mind. I'm used to giving presentations for like less than a dozen people here, that all live close to me. It blows my mind that I have people from New Jersey and all over. Thank you, Allie.
All right, well, I think that's probably about it for all the questions and everything. So I think it is time for us to wrap up. Thank
Are there
you
any
to everybody that joined us.
Are there any
But
other suggestions that you would have for future topics that you would like to see? If you have something else you would like to hear about, type it in the chat box or the question and answer, and I would be interested in knowing what people would like to know more about.
Mariola said, thank you for the presentation, very informative.
Thank you. Gardening for pollinators, we did one on butterfly gardens last month, but we can expand to pollinators too at some point too, more than just butterflies.
And if you follow that link, it will take you to our YouTube page where that video is still available to watch if you wanted to watch that back and see if it was able to answer any of your questions. Okay, so we didn't have anybody drop anything in yet. I will say that there will be an email going out this evening still that will have a link to a survey. It's just a 4-question survey. So if you think of a topic that you would love to see us cover, whether in the upcoming months or sometime next year when it is better timing, it can be a very specific topic and we might be able to expand on it. It might be a very general topic, whatever is something that you could use help with or that you would love to learn more about. You can let us know right away before we close out, or you can just utilize that survey and let us know through there as well. Any final closing remarks, Donna?
Nope, just thanks for coming and listening in.